Oh, hello there. Didn't see you. Welcome. You're joining the writing blog today. I hope you're doing well, whether you're listening or watching. As some of you at this point might know, my name's Mason. We have with us today a new member. Cody, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Cody. I'm Jonah's doppelganger in many ways. And I just write fantasy about blood.
Nice.
Pretty good
It's
fantasy.
true. It's true.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, Mason. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Cody. You're welcome. So today's conversation is kind of building off of our last conversation in which we discussed a little bit about some of the extemporaneous world building / character building activities that some of us have participated in. To set the foundation for this, I guess. When I first began writing, I kind of initially had Tolkien as like this golden standard of like fantasy and world building, right? You hear stories about like him drawing out maps, him building all these various languages and literal centuries of history so that he can kind of have this story, right? In fact, I believe at one point Tolkien himself wrote a scholarly article in which he argued that the pursuit of the writer of fiction was to tell a history that only they are privy to, right? And his world building as a result reflected that. Now, I don't think that Tolkien was entirely right in that argument. I don't think that fiction is wholly and entirely just the retelling of fantastic history that I alone know. But I do think that maybe he was onto something with some of his various world building activities. And so today, the thought was that we were going to talk about various kind of extra steps, if you will, that we have all participated in or have thought about participating in during our writing efforts. So I guess we can just go ahead and kind of start with that, guys. Like, have you guys ever done anything in the process of your world building or character building that probably was unnecessary but nevertheless was helpful to you?
See, it's funny because when I think about this, I have to go way back. Before I ever really thought of myself as a writer, I started out my adult life thinking that I was going to be an actor. And I spent, all of my college career and a goodly while after that working on plays and film stuff and whatnot. And early on in my character work, I would always do a character write-up for whoever I was supposed to be. That's not exactly the same thing that we're talking about, but it feels pretty analogous, right? Because I wanted to get a sense for the internal life of the person that I was supposed to be portraying so that I could know something beyond just the lines on the page and be able to bring more nuance to it. And I feel like that's very much in the same vein as what we're talking about, even though it may not necessarily be the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. As I talked about last time, in the past, I've written the same kind of cast of characters for a number of years now. And at one point during the course of that, I kind of wrote down all of their biographies. I am something of a discovery writer, so a number of those like biographical elements have since changed. But I do find that that was really helpful, kind of that character profile like you're talking about, Cameron. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I think Cameron's discussion of nuance in it is really important because I think the whole point of this is not, most of the time this world building isn't going to add to our plot or our story, but what it does is it makes everything feel more real. And so my favorite nuance I like to throw in when I'm planning world is industry. If I'm coming up with this massive fantasy world with all these countries, what are they doing? Does this country specialize in spices? Does this country specialize in fabrics, textiles? That sort of industry really determines what the weather, some crops might grow in better places. So you have to tailor the weather to that. You have to tailor people's living styles, their affluence. So that's my favorite thing to do. That really adds a little bit to every aspect of the world around the characters.
And
Yeah.
Cody, you write that out? Do you actually like write that out in some sort of prose form, all of that?
Not in prose form, but I'll write out like a couple, like maybe a paragraph or two about, you know, this place, because of this geographical location, specializes in this thing or this crop or something like that. It's in my outline.
Well, that ties to your major too, or I should say your area of study, which is economics. We were just talking about the other day, Cody. So it's interesting to hear how, you know, Cameron was talking about being an actor and how that informs, you know, Cody with the economic side of thing. I think it's fascinating how obviously our past lives, if you will, inform, you know, what we're doing now. But Cody, have you noticed that do you get inspired from your other work into that, do you think? Just out of curiosity.
Like, do I get inspired in my writing from things I'm learning in economics, or? Oh yeah, all the time. Recently, so I've been working on my current work for over a year now, and I took a class recently about economic growth, and it really identified what might be the difference between the super rich country in my book and the super poor country, you know. And the main thing about economic growth is it comes about from technology. And so I'm like, oh, that means I need my richer country to be, you know, better innovation, more scientists, more stuff like that. And it really determined what sort of the careers of the people around my characters would be like, and really added to it. So I would say definitely, yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. For me, I definitely, as been talked before, also come from a theater background, but I always used to resist those character profiles. I was like, I just want to get up and act. I just say what the characters say and make it real. So I don't really do that with my writing, but I think, unlike a lot of people here, more of a plotter as opposed to a pantser, as opposed to a discovery writer. I tend to plot out my plots and my worlds and my magic systems. A lot of stuff for me revolves heavily around coming up with a magic system for an area, and then figuring out what that does to everything, like what that's going to mean for the culture, what that's going to mean for the societies and the people involved in it, the jobs, the economics, all that stuff. And there's definitely certain areas that I tend to lean more into than others. I might lean more into like, how does that affect combat interactions? Not as much as like, you know, exchanging of, you know, monetary value, as perhaps I should. But I definitely do a lot with my magic systems, and I've got so much written out about them. Also, I like bringing in various, you know, races and thinking about them. And then also, I also do tend to think about some sort of major, I love fights and tournaments and all those things being the type of gamer I am. So I also try to think about how that can realistically be happening in this sort of society and how that would connect together. And then my work on the characters, I learn about them as I'm writing them. And then I come back and like flesh them out after the fact in a lot of cases.
Taking it to character for a minute.
Go ahead.
Taking it to character for a minute, my most out of the way thing I've done for character building recently is I had a character whose older sister was in college, and she's majoring in fashion and accessory design, which is a very unique major. I can't just make up classes for that the way you can say, oh, she's in biology, she's going to a biology lab today. And so I tracked down a school that had a major in that, and I scrolled through their course catalog. I was looking at all the different courses she could take. I was looking at a study abroad she could go on. And the extra part is I had questions about how their course system worked, because it was different than colleges I was used to. I wasn't sure what the graduation time of it would be. And so I made a college profile in this character's name, and I put my real email address on there. And now a couple times a month, whether I wanted to or not, I get these emails that say, Drina, there's still time to apply. Drina, join us for a virtual event. Drina, don't you want to come here? I'm like, no, Drina's not real. I don't need this. But now I know what she's doing with her life.
Waiting for Drina to get a scholarship, and then like, you gotta go. Like, I see this like whole movie, you know, like teen comedy playing out here.
Drina's disappointing us all.
The price we pay for
she's
our
British. She's fine.
the price we pay. Cameron, you had something, right?
So I was just going to say, so we've got several different kinds of information that people have talked about now, right? I know for myself, I rarely do character profiles anymore, but I do always try and jot down for myself stuff that I've dreamed up that might come back later, that I might want to remember or know later, so I don't either reinvent the wheel and waste my time, or even worse, come up with something different and then have my book not agree with itself. But I just end up with this sort of catch-all file of bullet points that talks, it might talk about, you know, what the money is, or different nations, or different, whatever it is that I'm thinking of at the moment. And it all just sort of ends up jumbled together with character stuff. Oh, this person I think is going to do this other thing later, and so I'll throw that down in there too. And it's a mess, and I can never find what I need. Do you folks, do you just have one document? Do you separate out your documents into places, people, systems? Like, how do you do that?
Well, thinking about my outline, I know I separate it, you know, so I generally start with the most overview things at the top of the document and then get into specifics the further down you go. So at the top, I'm like, okay, these are my countries. This is a little bit about each of them. Okay, these are my main characters. This is a little bit about each of them. Here's the magic system. And so on. I think the separation really helps. You know, it definitely, at the very least, it might be jumbled within the section, but at least I know everything's going to be thematically tied together.
I have so much, so many pages of like it depends on which series I'm talking about, but I've like got like wars they fought in, previous like leaders, like, and so it's easy to get it caught up together. So I've actually tried a couple different systems. You can use a wiki that is downloadable, and then you can like just have that wiki saved on your computer. I like it because it is a pretty easy to use wiki, and I did use that to like break out for countries and like magic systems for the different countries, cultures for the different countries, stuff with leaders for the different countries, things like that. But it only saves like on one computer, and I've got, you know, a PC and I've got a Mac, so I can't like, you know, bring it from one of the others. So that doesn't work out well. There are some paid services you can use, because I've looked into it, that literally specialize in this, literally specialize in you putting, you know, all this stuff up. Scrivener has some capabilities with this as well, with saving like, you know, pictures and stuff like that. So that's another option. But I ended up just doing everything on Google Drive. Google Drive doesn't have all of the functionality that I would love or want, but it does have most of it to let you create, you know, different folders for, you know, world building or magic system, and then folders within folders about those things. You can do some color coding, some numbering. So, and that thankfully is accessible from anything. So there's definitely a fair bit of organization I need to do still in my many, many files, and also stuff I've written longhand, because sometimes you just want to write, I don't know, for me, I love writing world building longhand, but then it's such a pain to find. So like, I also need to transfer everything that's longhand there. Or audio. When I'm free, I'll just like do a recording of like, oh, this is happening in this world, or oh, this is the history. And so I've got all these audio files that I need to also transfer, which I've done with some, but not all. So there's that.
There's definitely a danger of getting lost in notes anytime you get into world building, even drafting, quite frankly. I had a time in my life where I didn't have access to a computer for about a year and a half. And so I had 6 notebooks that I filled out longhand. I have 4 of them here. And I had to go back and transcribe all the notes. And this notebook was missing for a couple months. So I had over 5,000 words of content that I couldn't start a book without, and they were just nowhere to be found. So make sure that you bookmark this in some way, whatever format you're using, whether it's physical paper, a wiki, a document, because you're going to have more notes that you're going to need later, and they're going to fall by the wayside. I was outlining a book series I was writing a few years ago, and I specifically wanted this country to be based on a South American type system, and I wanted there to be llamas. So I had a very clear note that this country has llamas, and the name of this country was something I came up with through Google Translate that meant llama. There were definitely llamas from the beginning. 5 years later, I find that note, and the book has no llamas.
Of course.
Classic.
Yeah, I guess that brings up like another point. Then how strictly do y'all hew to these things? Or do you find very often that as you're going, oh no, now this is not going to work, I need to change it to this? Or, you know, like how much does the final product tend to match a lot of that early planning?
In my case, if I can go ahead, not very much, to be honest. Which I think with my planning, what I'm reaching for is not, I think maybe what I'm reaching for in everything that I write is just verisimilitude, if that makes sense, right? Like I want it to have the appearance of reality and to be just real enough that it never pulls the reader out because they're like, ooh, that's unrealistic, or ooh, I don't like that, right? And so as a result of that, like I went the Erica route when I did the original character biographies and whatnot. And I wrote them out in a journal longhand, which I do have still somewhere. I like to draw. And at the time I also drew every single one of the characters as I wrote out their biographies and stuff, so that I had kind of like an image to describe in the future and things like that. I don't think that was necessary at all. And honestly, I've gone back and read a total of 0 of those biographies ever since. I think another thing that kind of helped a little bit with that pursuit is I was raised doing a lot of memorization stuff, both in school and at home. When I was like in 3rd grade, I memorized an entire Shel Silverstein poem that was like a couple pages long. And at home, I come from a fairly religious family, which personally I'm grateful for. And on every day, we would memorize passages of scripture together and things like that as well. And so just the process of writing those biographies down, because of all of this kind of habitual memorization that I've done throughout my life, I have a lot of the biographical stuff just memorized, and I've gone off of it since. And as a result of that, when I need to change things, I can just change it. And I don't have to really go back and actually scratch it out, because it's all just kind of in here. I'm certainly not going to say that my mind is a fortress, and as a result, everything is perfectly aligned, right? But generally speaking, that has kind of served me well enough. Just the process of writing it down helps me remember it.
For me, looking back at my notes that I make, I find that the world building stuff tends to stay pretty stable and pretty solid. And that's useful information to me to go back to. Character information frequently changes. And so frequently I'll go back to my notes on who different characters are supposed to be, as I'm now, 2/3 of the way through the novel or approaching the end of the novel. And I'm like, I had no idea who this person was, because I figured out who they were as I was writing. But for whatever reason, for me at least, the world building stuff, the economies and the features of the world and the magic systems, those tend to stay pretty stable, and those tend to be more useful notes for me.
I would say most everything stays pretty much the same. If anything, it's just more that things add. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you can write yourself into a corner and realize you've got 2 conflicting systems, or a conflicting moment where a character behaved one way, now they're behaving another way, and that's not good. You want that character consistency, unless you've set up that they're an inconsistent person. But I would say for the most part, stuff that I create and find, then it's adding. Not always, of course, there can be exceptions. As in the book Steve and I wrote, we realized we were doing part of the magic system like completely different for like certain characters and how they worked, and then that obviously has big effects. So there can be big sweeping changes like that, and you want to do what's best for the story, of course. So if a change is needed, it should be made. But I would say usually it's more additive. It's more like, okay, I know this base, and then I'm realizing this can go here and this can go here. And I would say that just 2 quick things have been on my mind from this conversation. One is the amazing moment to me as a plotter when things like slide into place and you realize, oh, this is how this works. And of course it works that way. It always worked that way. I just didn't realize it until this exact moment. I think that the way I'm saying it, it actually sounds like a discovery writing thing, which in a way it is, because you're finding it. It sounds like the bones that are in the earth that Stephen King talks about that we need on earth and find. But the other thing that I was going to point out there is that I think even if we are discovering something, and even if some of us are writing characters in Discovery Way, we do still need to know certain things about them to even write a story. We do need to know like what it is they want, generally why they can't have it is like the standard, writing style. So this isn't to say usually that you would jump in with no information. You do need to know a little bit usually about everything, even to begin a story, I think. unless you're writing fan fiction, which can be a great way to practice the craft.
Yeah, I think in general, for most of us, I imagine with world building stuff, we only put that in our world building document if we know it's something like, this is good. We really like this. You know, I'm just going to be sitting and thinking about what this country's main industry is. But once I figured out, there's no reason to change it. I settled on that because I wanted it. But with characters, you know, characters are people. People change, and you can't map out exactly who a person is from the beginning without stepping in their shoes a little and writing out what a chapter might look like. So I think it makes sense that our world building piece will be pretty set in stone, and then our characters will just change on the fly.
My experience, character change is going to alter the direction of your story more than any other change you can make. I'm working on my third or fourth revision of a book I've written right now in our writing group. And I've gone back and I've retroactively changed the world system, the world building, the magic system twice. And those were relatively easy changes. There are times I needed some tweaking, but I can make it work. But the thing that made me had to completely overhaul a draft is I had two characters who were sisters, and one of them had murdered their parents. And the initial draft, I thought, well, of course the younger sister didn't want their parents dead. She loves their parents. Why would that be? And then I wrote the whole book that way. I wrote a whole sequel that way. There's so many words. And then I was out shopping one day, and I was just kind of walking around the mall in a haze because I was so lost in my story. And I realized, okay, if these two sisters were raised by these terrible parents who gave one of their children reason enough to murder them, there's no way that the little sister could have liked them. They're definitely co-conspirators, and that changes everything. Not just the relationship between the sisters, but the relationships with everybody else, because they're sharing things that they wouldn't normally share and hide other things, because everything they're doing is based on covering up this murder. And that completely made me have to redo the draft, which isn't a bad thing. I'm glad for that first draft. I'm glad about the things I learned about my world and the plot so far, but character is what made me have to completely overhaul it.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe just sound a slightly contrary note on this, in that I, tend to just dive into the writing. I guess I'm very much discovery, and I was really fascinated in this discussion because I have find the spots where I get stuck is when I have to make something up, and then I'm like, oh crap, now I gotta make something up for this, and that is really hard, and then I'm off onto this like planning or figuring out what the detail is. But for the book I'm doing now with Jeff, I mean, I was really, I had to make up a specific test, and I had to make up like a specific way this power was going to work. And that actually led me then to go, oh, the world is going to be like this. Like, that's how the whole kind of geopolitical thing happened to this whole thing. And I wouldn't have gone that direction. We weren't going exactly in that direction until like I had to start writing this very specific task for my character. And now like I really love it, but I don't know if I would have thought that through that way without this specific like writing challenge that was directly in front of me.
Yeah. I think no matter whether you're doing your world building on the fly or doing it beforehand, I was talking to a friend yesterday. They were specifically speaking about the movie Tenet. And we were just kind of talking about Christopher Nolan in general. Cody is giving 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. I personally actually have not yet seen the film. If I'm gonna be totally honest, and that's probably not a good thing to be on the internet, but I'm gonna do it anyways because I'm a bold man, I guess. Either that or just crazy. But I'm a little burned out on Nolan films, to be honest. And so with Tenet, I was like, I'm just gonna take a break. I'm just gonna sit this one out. I'm just gonna relax a little bit, I think, and not watch this one. And I've had people criticize for me that for doing that already. But this isn't a TV show about my Christopher Nolan habits. Anyways, what I'm getting at Cody's already messaging me defenses, and I'm sure I'll get a lot of people in comments or something like that doing the same. What I'm getting at here is I think with fiction, the greatest moment of disconnect that you can potentially run into is when you break rules you have set, right? I think that is the example that I gave yesterday, and the example I'll give again because I think it's a good one, is Wile E. Coyote walks off a cliff, falls miles to what should be his death, and then gets up and walks away, and we don't care, right? But if Jason Bourne jumps off of the Empire State Building and then gets up afterwards and walks away, people are going to walk out of the movie, right? Unless you give a reason why he can. But then Jason Bourne can kill 7 people in a couple of seconds. And if Wile E. Coyote did the same thing, you'd have people turning off their TVs. 1, because they're like, why is my child being exposed to this violence? And 2, because they're like, Wile E. Coyote's not a badass. Like, what's happening here? My apologies for the language there. My apologies. Anyhow, what I'm getting at here is I think no matter what your process is, hopefully during your writing process, kind of figure out a way by which to make sure that you're not breaking your own rules, whether it's on the fly or beforehand, just because that is something that will almost guaranteed take your readers out. Really quick, if I can, I don't know how much time we have left, but I am curious about this because I have noticed something in my writing process and want to know if it's just me. How does this differ? I know we only have a couple of people in this group that have written both fantasy and science fiction, but I'm curious, does your process change between the two? Because mine changes drastically, and I'm wondering if that's the case for you guys as well.
Wait, real quick though, Mason, how so? How does it change between sci-fi and fantasy?
That's a good question, Steve. So for those of you at home and for those of you in the group that don't know, I write both science fiction and fantasy, but the science fiction series that I'm writing takes place about 50 years in the future. And as a result, it also takes place on Earth, right? And so I don't need to establish geography, right? It's already done. I've already got a globe that I'm working with. And even if places are drastically different, I know where they are now. And so I'm kind of extrapolating, right? And so I don't necessarily need to found entirely new civilization. Whereas when I do fantasy, like in my particular kind of fantasy shared world that the vast majority of my fantasy stories take place in, I studied like geography a little bit and cartography and things like that so that I could draw a world map and have continents be in places that were semi-reasonable with ecology and environmental situations that are also semi-reasonable, so I'm not breaking verisimilitude, right? And then furthermore, on top of that, like now I'm studying the creation of civilizations and also like religions and things like that, right? Because I want my theology to also be reasonable and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of more of a holistic world creation in fantasy for me than I'm doing beforehand. Whereas in science fiction, I'm kind of like, all right, here's my world. Here are the couple things that are different that I know and understand. And now I'm just running with it, kind of. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a good point when you mentioned the word reasonable. I haven't written a lot of sci-fi, but I have done a little, and I'm toying with an outline, an idea for a rewrite of a sci-fi book I wrote before. And what I'm finding is that, you know, I don't have to do the world. I don't have to come up with a globe like you said, but what I do have to come up with is reasonable technologies that are vaguely grounded in reality or continuous to something we had before. You can't, it seems a lot more difficult in sci-fi to come up with something completely and utterly magical and still have it be like in the realm of like technology and sci-fi. At that point, sort of maybe something like Dune bleeds between the two. if you're trying to write like military sci-fi with spaceships and laser guns and all this fun stuff, you have to find some way of saying, look, this is based off this technology that you can maybe realistically understand could be bounded by science. Whereas with fantasy, it's just like, this is the magic. The magic is cool like this. But what you do have to give in the fantasy is, okay, the magic we're taking for granted, you need to now justify the world to us.
This is an interesting question to me. I think I actually, at least so far in my writing, have approached sci-fi and fantasy in a very similar way in terms of how I approach my world building and my structure. And I didn't realize that I did this until I stopped to think about it, but I always, once I've got the basics of what kind of story I'm trying to write and what kind of world I'm in, I sketch out a map. Now, I don't know anything about cartography, so my maps are probably awful, but it gives me a basic sense of where am I and where are these people going to go. And then from there, I tend to go, okay, what's my tech level? And sort of develop out what that is going to look like. And that's, of course, going to be a very different process for sci-fi than for fantasy, but it is the same basic exercise. In that, you know, you've got to decide what people are working with and then how they're going to be working. Whether that's, you know, cart and pulley kind of stuff or FTL kind of stuff. And from there, I feel like once I've got my window dressing and my set, I can focus on what's happening to these people and who are these people.
I think a lot depends on if you're writing alt-world sci-fi or you're writing like urban fantasy / near future. Because in both urban fantasy and near future, you do get to lean on like, this is the world, like we know what a car is, we know what, you know, we know what Kleenex are, you know, stuff like that. Maybe not in near future, Kleenex isn't around anymore. But the idea is that, you know, there are definitely things we don't need to spend as a lot of time on. I do think that's why, you know, well, this is another conversation of what type of stories can be written a little bit faster because of certain things. But yeah, I think depending on how far you want to add stuff to your world that is happening in the near future or has this urban fantasy theme, obviously you could do tons of additional stuff with those as well. But I think, as you know, Mason, you're saying there is a base to draw from. So yeah, I would think you're definitely going to do things in some ways slightly differently when there is a base to draw from, because you say, what parts of the base am I using that people already know, that's a shared knowledge, and what am I adding to it? Versus if it's alternate world, then it's very much like fantasy, which is what's my world, what's my history, what are my people? And so I think the alt world and fantasy end up feeling very similar to each other in terms of setting up, at least in my experience.
In my opinion, just speaking to that, the more shared knowledge there is between you and your audience, the more you have to know, right? So I've got one short, well, shortish novella length urban fantasy that I set in Tijuana. And I spent more time on that story than on any of my stories that I've written, like on Google Maps and on message boards, reading about different neighborhoods and how safe are they and what do they look like, and finding like sort of street level photos, so that somebody who is familiar with that part of the world, I could have some verisimilitude with them, right? So that it made sense to them, because it is real, it can be experienced. That's an actual city, you know. Whereas when I'm making it up from whole cloth, I can just give you the broad sketches, and if I just focus in on one or two things and make them specific, then it looks like I've built this whole world when really it's a Potemkin village. That, you know, is just the backdrop, and you see it from the river and it looks amazing, and you drive past. And honestly, that's a whole lot easier. The more specific you've got to be and the more real a place is, the more work you've got to do.
Yeah. I think in my particular comparison, right, between the science fiction and fantasy situation that I'm in, my sci-fi material, even though it takes just a little bit around 50 years in the future, it's also basically kind of a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk situation, right? So even though the first book starts in Seattle, I did do some research on Seattle. I did try, but it was pretty limited, and didn't need to be very extensive, right? Because this isn't the same Seattle that there is today. I think if, and Erica may be able to speak to this a little bit, but historical fiction, right? That's a whole other arena that I don't think we've even touched on, but that from what I have heard and listened to and understood, requires a lot from the writer as far as like research and whatnot is concerned.
Yeah, I've never written a full-on historical fiction novel. I've done a short story, but I did do a very historical inspired fantasy book. That's what I have over here. Cover fell off since I showed you last. It's that old. And there's so much to deal with in terms of accuracy and, like you said, verisimilitude. I was writing this when I didn't have access to a computer, so I couldn't fact check things. And I was writing a scene where people were moving along on a steamboat, and I thought, oh, well, in wooden sailing ships, you want to go to your bed, it's below decks. So have them go below decks on a steamboat. And I did have access to a video with a steamboat in it at this time, and I watched and I realized the bottom is flat. There is no below decks. So I'm grateful that I wrote at a time I was volunteering at a history center, so I did have access to a lot of historical material, but even if it's not going to be real, it is going to have to be its own kind of real. So make sure that, as has been said before by all of us, that it checks out both with itself and with the reader's idea of what kind of world that type of place, that type of time should be.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I think we're just about at time, but we've gone a lot of directions in this video. So maybe to kind of bring it together a little bit. The pursuit and the name of the game here is reasonability, as Cody said, or maybe if you want to get fancy, my word that I like, verisimilitude.
That's the word of the day.
Verisimilitude, the word of the day. And just know your readers, know your audience, and try and gauge what they're going to expect from you. And if they expect some research, be ready to research. And if you don't want to research, maybe write something else that won't require it from you. Whatever the case, we're glad you joined us. We hope you have a spectacular rest of the day. And we will see you later, blockheads.